Now my distinct pleasure to announce our next speaker, and I will tell you that this extraordinary technology that the executive global chairman of Star Scientific and Planet Power Systems is about to introduce to the audience is a game changer should we be able to get hydrogen at the scale that we're going to need it. And I believe that he's going to tell us about some breakthroughs. But Andrew Horvath from Sydney, Australia, please take the stage. We're delighted that you're here, and we would like to have you tell us how we can all be heroes. Thank you.
Thanks, Chip, and we've made Chip an honorary Aussie now that he's come down twice to Australia and spent a lot of time with us. First thing I want to make a statement on is what a different conversation Australia is having to what I'm hearing here. Our conversation has completely switched to hydrogen. It just basically in about a period of 6 months, everyone, and it wasn't government driven. We don't tend to do that in Australia. We don't go, the government's driving this and we've got to elect the right people. Industry just packed up, and it was the guys who were doing the investment. They were the guys that shifted it. Macquarie, biggest investment group in the world, just went, that's it, we're into hydrogen. Some of the big power players were into hydrogen. That's it, we've had enough of this. We're going to start doing this. State government after state government. So it's a very interesting dynamic to listen to what I've just been hearing. So what I wanted to do today is I've got another speech tomorrow morning about Hiro itself. But what I wanted to do today was to run through why Star spent 80 million on hydrogen over the years and the experience that we've had in why we've ended up heading there as a nation, and also we've just come out of 2 weeks in Europe, and it's very, very similar in Europe. Also, it's an honour to sponsor this event. It's an absolute honour. When Chip said, we were looking for sponsors, we put up hand up immediately. What a great, group of people. We've looked at the previous AREDAYs, we've looked at what you're trying to do, and we agree with you 100%. So we're really honoured to be here. Okay, we firmly believe that hydrogen will be the essential fundamental element in a low carbon future. The goal of all of us, and what we should envision, is not just because of climate change, it should be a priority to order the lower environmental pollution with all its implications and to pass on sustainable environment to the next generations. Where's my clicker gone? There it is. Right. Okay, so let's look at the case for green baseload power. So what we're going to talk about here is the state of renewables and power generation, the consequence of higher shares of solar and wind in the power market, as we've experienced in Australia, solution scenarios for a carbon-free production. So let's start with the current state of renewables and power generation. This chart shows the declining costs for different renewables and the different technologies between 2010 and 2018. As you'll see there highlighted, the utility scale PV, for instance, the global weighted average, the LCOE, has fallen by 77% between 2010 and 2018. Prices for the solar PV modules have fallen by over 90% since the end of 2009, with a reduction of around 1/3 between 2017 and 2018 alone. Much of this reduction will prominently flow into projects commissioned this year in 2019. Many parts of the world today, renewables already are the lowest cost source of new power generation. You can see that in the chart there. As costs for solar and wind technologies continue falling, this will become the case in even more countries. By 2020, onshore wind and solar photovoltaics, PVs, are set to join hydropower in consistently offering a less expensive source of new electricity than the least cost fossil fuel alternatives without financial assistance. This has significant implications for the cost of energy transition and is likely pathways to decarbonising the energy production and use beyond the electricity sector. Indeed, the declining and very low cost of electricity for solar PVs and onshore wind, as well as the cost reductions for concentrated power, concentrated solar power, and offshore wind to 2020 and beyond mean that renewable power is becoming competitive backbone of the global energy sector transformation. So what's the share of wind and solar generation in selected regions of the world? If you look here, 2017, Denmark and South Australia lead the pack. They reached about 50% in net generation, compared with a bit below 20% in Texas and California. What are the implications of a higher share of solar, wind and power as a sector as a whole? So let's have a closer look at that. Let's start with the characteristics of wind and solar. Compared with conventional green technologies, the two renewable energy sources have two main distinctive features. First is their cost pattern is characterised by high investment and negligible variable costs. Second, their operational output is governed by weather conditions, limiting their availability and causing mismatches between supply and demand. Because of the intermittency of solar and wind, we need utilities that generate baseload, peak and backup power. In order to fill the gap between solar and wind and output and demand, now this gap is called net load. On this chart, in the area below the violet line, is net load. The yellow line on this chart shows the total power demand and its change over a course of a sample day. Everything between the yellow and violet line generated is by solar and wind. We can see that renewable productions produce most of their output midday when the sun's at its peak. The output in the evening throughout the night is coming from wind turbines. Net load generation is a crucial component to the power backbone, and it has to always secure 100% of power demand at any given time. If that can't be met, the grid fails, resulting in power outages. The only currently available renewable option at scale for net load is hydro and pumped hydro storage, as well as in select regions, say geothermal. In regions where this is not an option, fossil fuel and nuclear plants meet and generate net load. The problem is that the output from renewables and wind and solar can drop dramatically by hundreds of megawatts in short periods, such as 30 minutes. More renewables in the grid mean that net load, base load and peak load power generation have become more and more flexible for coal-fired plants, and this is a problem. This is a real challenge for coal-fire to be that flexible. Depending on the geographical location, there also might be a distinct seasonal differences and profiles of solar and wind outputs, with low amounts of solar and sometimes also wind power during winter time, when demand for heat is high. In addition to the problem with intermittency of solar and wind, the rise of renewables is increasingly leading to an economically challenging situation. During the last decade, wind and solar electricity generation have been ramped up and pushed into the power grid. Renewables and an increasing number of regions now account for more than 30% of daytime capacity. Now that sounds like good news, and renewables and low marginal costs are great energy producers. So what's the problem? Here we can see the net load demand for a typical spring day in California. Each of the lines represents the projected total net load for an average March day for a year in a period from 2012 to 2020. So 2012 at the top there, and slowly gets the trough down as they start to bring more renewables in. We can see that each year the net load during the day is pushed further down into a trough as more solar is added to the grid. This pattern is called a duck curve. The result in huge changes in demand for baseload power generators over a short period of time. And in this example, 13 gigawatt net load ramp up was required in 3 hours in the afternoon when the solar output decreased. Traditional coal power plants, particularly in older, more run-down power plants, can't quickly be turned on or off. They need longer ramp-up and shutdown periods, and are not as fast enough to react to the quick, constant changes of wind and solar output. So these plants have continued running at certain levels through the trough time, and of course producing pollution when they do so. This leads to a potential overgeneration in the trough, sending wholesale prices down to near or even below zero. Wind and solar have in effect driven down the cost of daytime energy so far that they threaten to make reliable coal-fired power stations, which are essential at the moment for baseload power, unprofitable well in advance of their natural shelf life. Rising electrification in the transport sector, new data centres, the Internet of Things and others will lead to higher demands in baseload power in the foreseeable future. Ask any person under 50 in the street where they store their movies, pictures, corporate documents. It'll be on the cloud, in a data centre gobbling up power at rates unheard of a few years ago. Every application offers you cloud storage, antivirus software now, games, and I have a cooking app at home that offered me free storage. For governments and energy policy, this is a dilemma. So let's have a look at Australia, Japan and China and how they're planning to secure their baseload generation in the foreseeable future. In Australia, optimistic output forecasts for renewables and increasing economic pressures led some operators to decommission some baseload power plants in recent years, namely Hazelwood in Victoria. This caused significant stress for the grid stability and led to repeated outages in periods of peak demand, particularly in summertime when high demand of air conditioning. Power shortages for several 100,000 households have been the result, the last one being on January 19 this year in Victoria. Considering this, the previous Turnbull government in 2018 started promoting the establishment of new coal-fired power stations. They also commissioned the Snowy Mountains Pumped Hydro Scheme, a 2 gigawatt monster of a project that is already experiencing massive cost blowouts. Japan is the most vocal proponent of hydrogen economy and green power. Despite this, it's fired up at least 8 new coal-fired power stations in the last 2 years. It has plans for an additional 36 over the next decade. The biggest planned coal power expansion in any developed nation, not including China and India. Last month, its government took the key step of locking a national energy plan in that will have coal provide 26% of Japan's electricity by 2030. They abandoned the previous goal down to what they wanted to do was 10%. The reversal is partly a result of the 2011 disaster at Fukushima, which punctured public support for nuclear energy. Critics say the coal revival has an alarming implications, and they're right, for air pollution and Japan's ability to meet its pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions, which account for 4% of the world's total. If all the planned coal power plants are built, it will be difficult for us to meet our emission reduction goals, said the Minister of Environment Nakagawa, and he noted this earlier this year. And in China, despite shutting old plants, mainly because pollution issues, new plants are more than replacing lost output, resulting in still rising power outputs from coal. So they're shutting down smaller, inefficient plants, and they're putting up plants 4 to 5 times the power and 4 to 5 times the pollution. At the same time, as renewables squeeze baseload generation, they put themselves under stress. The massive influx of renewables into the national electricity market in Australia, as an example, has triggered warnings that the end of the investment boom in wind and solar could be approaching, as the economics of some plants are exposed to wholesale prices. They are being deeply undermined. The new figures released just now at the beginning of August 2019 by respected analytical firm Green Markets found that in Australia, the total solar power generation doubled in June compared with 2 years previously. On June 30, the share of renewable power fed into the grid in Victoria and South Australia rose to 39%. Average wholesale prices were down, however, by 60% on that day compared to the same day in 2017, and more than 40% lower in New South Wales and Queensland, according to the Australian market operator data. That leaves not only coal, but also prospective renewable plants potentially vulnerable. Tristan Edis, Australian Green Market Director, expects zero or negative prices on the national energy market in Australia to become a lot more common in the next 12 months across states other than South Australia. He quoted that this is going to kill this boom in renewables, unfortunately, and he said that in the Australian Financial Review in July. So this leaves us with a key question. How can we further increase renewables and at the same time address problems with baseload generation? We believe the solution to this dilemma lies in energy storage at a large scale and later use in its baseload power generation. So let's have a look. It makes a lot of sense to store surplus energy, as previous speakers have said, from renewables and dispatch to the grid at later times when renewables can't match demand. We need to balance not only daily but also weekly, monthly, seasonal variations of renewable energy production. So what are the options to store and dispatch energy at different scales? These are the currently availables for energy storage in different sizes, from kilowatts to gigawatts to terawatts. They're also in relation to different discharge times, storage times. What we need to solve the problem of the duck curve is gigawatt to terawatts of storage. For discharge times of days and up to months. So you can see on this chart there that, when you look at batteries compared to air pump storage, hydrogen comes out to be a very, very, very useful gas indeed. When looking at this chart, you can see that the only clean zero legacy feasible option for this size storage is hydrogen, either in pure form or bound to other carriers. Hydrogen promises to become the low-cost option for storing electricity over days, weeks or months. Excess electricity can get converted to hydrogen using electrolyzers and back to heat or electricity when needed. Besides electrolyzers, there's a number of technologies in development that might provide additional or better options to produce hydrogen, alternative to the use of electrolyzers. In fact, straight after this conference, I'm going to see a very exciting development developed right here in the USA. Without having the time shift application in mind, it might at first seem counterintuitive to use electricity to produce hydrogen and then produce electricity again. But the reality is, it's the same principle that's being used in pump storage hydro for decades. Low-cost excess electricity is used to pump water to high storage reservoirs and then converted back to electricity at times of high demand. Whilst the efficiencies look dodgy, the economics works. And despite the loss of energy in both steps of the conversion. In the same way, with even larger storage capacities, hydrogen can get generated and stored at times when the power supply exceeds demand and prices are low. The stored hydrogen can then get converted back into electricity when supply does not meet demand and the wholesale electricity is high. Hydrogen is extremely versatile. Depending on the need, hydrogen can be stored as pure hydrogen, pressurised or liquid. It can get bound to carrier substances like nitrogen to form ammonia, metal hydrides, or oils, for example, like toluene, which is a potential option for the use in transportation. It can be transported, distributed with trucks, ships or pipelines. It can be stored in tanks or caverns, as they do in Leeds in England, and Leeds is 60% hydrogen now, all their gas, everything else they're doing is hydrogen. And it can be used for many different applications in building heating, industry, transport, as looked at in this presentation, power generation. In the future, a low-carbon world, hydrogen can effectively enable the storage and the trade of wind and sunshine between different regions. Hydrogen generated in regions with abundant solar and wind resources, such as Australia or Latin America, can get exported to regions with high demand thousands of miles away. In this way, it replaces fossil fuels as a tradable energy commodity, and that is vital. The world energy commodity relies on energy movement to keep the balance of M1, M2 and M3 and the money cycles working. Hydrogen can also provide an additional way for countries and industries to store reserves of energy strategically in a highly electrified, low-carbon world, similar as is done in fossil fuel reserves today. Using hydrogen instead of carbon-containing fuels and energy, end users not only cut CO2 but reduces local air pollution by completely eliminating particulates, sulphur oxides, nitric oxides, ground-level ozones and other toxins, thus improving environmental and health outcomes. Urban air pollution and its related health impacts are now major drivers of energy policy decisions, and governments are clearly interested in ways of reducing pollution and fixing air quality. Many have talked about the transportation sector as acting as the enabler for the hydrogen economy. But we think using hydrogen for baseload power generation is faster and more impactful way to kickstart the carbon-free hydrogen economy and stop pollution and help mitigate climate change on a large scale and quickly. In essence, storing surplus energy and shifting it to times with unmatched demand has a price stabilising effect. It prevents prices from getting too low or negative in the times of high supply and prevents prices spiking too high in times of lower supply and high demand. It therefore can effectively counter the duck curve formation and allows for a further increase of solar and wind capabilities. These added capacities in solar and wind don't necessarily have to be connected to the grid either. Setting up solar and wind farms for dedicated and off-the-grid hydrogen production increases the load on the electrolysers, which leads to better efficiencies and economies of production of hydrogen. Now, this has been demonstrated by the approval, just a few days ago, and the independent bank funding of a 15 gigawatt coal, wind and solar hydrogen park in Western Australia. Hydrogen production and storage on large scale can be utilised to replace fossil fuels in baseload and allow further decarbonisation of power generation. It can solve the economic distress provided by the duck curve. So how can hydrogen be effectively used in the production of baseload power? That's more of a topic for tomorrow's presentation. It'll show you how Hiro's technology allows the conversion of existing fossil fuel plants to run on hydrogen and thus become free from pollution and CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. Converting existing plants allows them to extend their lifetime and prevent standard assets. And in total, we're talking about $1 trillion worth of infrastructure that people currently want to throw away. Hiro can not only be used to convert existing coal plants, but can also run at high efficiencies in new plants, preferably using closed-loop gas turbines running with supercritical CO2 or helium, as Siemens is developing in Europe. The goal is the complete decarbonisation of the grid. With dedication, it can be done in the near future, fast enough to still meet the CO2 criteria set out by COP21 in Paris. We are convinced this can be done. So in closing, before a few questions, let me premiere our latest short animation here live at AREDAY and let you see what we're planning to do.
Since the Industrial Revolution, we've powered our economies with steam turbines driven by burning coal. We've thrived on the black stuff. But today, it's clear something's got to give. While powering our progress, coal-fired energy has polluted our environment. Advances in science mean we know better and we can do better. But if we shut coal down, what comes next? Some fear closing coal power plants will cost jobs and hurt the economy. Wind and solar aren't predictable enough to fill the generation gap. We need to find a balance. Predictable power without the pollution. Enter Hiro, the Hydrogen Energy Release Optimizer. It's a source of clean, dependable and safe power, making it a perfect substitute for coal in traditional power plants. By keeping the turbines turning, minus the burning, Hiro will breathe new life into existing power plants. Fueled by green hydrogen made from renewables like solar and wind, it creates a bridge between the old and new power generation that solves our energy crisis. Hiro means a faster, cheaper transition to a smarter energy future, a more resilient economy and a healthier community. It protects livelihoods while preserving our environment for future generations. Limitless power, zero emissions, that's our Hiro.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I've still got some time here, I think, so I'm happy to take questions, and then tomorrow morning I'll be telling you a lot more about what Hiro is and how it works. So happy to take some questions.
Luca Poanga from Energy Africa Conference. My question is, when do you hope to have this technology commercialized?
We're just about to receive delivery of a 1.5 megawatt turbine. Steam turbine. It'll be connected to a 5.5, 6 megawatt thermal Hiro unit, probably by first quarter next year. We're moving plants to a 100,000 square metre plant at the moment, so we can start manufacturing much larger systems. Tomorrow I'll be showing you what is next for Hiro, which is quite spectacular. I would suggest probably 2021, 2022, we will be in a plant. Hiro can be built very economically with current technology very fast. So, we're going to be moving as quickly as we can to start fixing these problems. As General Clark pointed out, we're in a mess. And it definitely means we have to move, and that's what we're doing in this company. We have made an absolute demand on our staff, on our scientists, and we're hiring more people. We've got a brilliant young team of scientists now, on top of experienced people, experienced hands and experienced engineers, all dying to move into this plant in November, so that we can really start to ramp this up. We're currently testing that unit, and all those tests are proving very positive. So we're really happy with the progress.
Do you anticipate scaling up programs?
No. Hiro is a catalyst, so it's basically surface area. More surface area, more hydrogen and oxygen, more energy. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you discuss how your technology can help coal-fired plants convert to hydrogen? Is that an expensive process of conversion?
No, it isn't. The process of conversion, Hiro is in fact a very fancy heat exchanger. It's a lot smaller than a current coal-fired plant. So to give you an idea, current coal-fire systems, they allow radiation of heat. Hiro is attached directly to the pipes that are doing the heat. So if you imagine, it's a good example out here in this sort of country. If you come in from the snow and you have a lovely burning fire and you put your hands up to warm the fire, that's one thing. Well, if you want to get warm, why don't you go pick up the log? Because that's conduction, and that's what Hiro does. So we get a huge energy transfer directly through that mechanism, through the pipes directly to the water or gas or whatever else we need to heat. Hiro can cover a vast range of industrial applications, desalination, and we're working on them all. They're all lined up in labs, being tested, being worked on, being accredited by universities and government. Star Scientific has a very proud record of a AAA rating with the federal government of Australia. Every year we receive $1.2 to $1.8 to $2 million back in tax refunds after we've been audited scientifically that we're doing the right thing. And we've been doing that for 10 years.
To help China achieve the Paris Accord goals, could you license someday this technology to China for conversion?
Let me tell you, China's an interesting one. China's initial issues are not necessarily power generation. China's initial issues are actually lignite burning district heating. The issue you have in China, when we all saw the Olympics and there were shots of the Australian swimmers standing up at the pool and you couldn't see them at the other end of the pool because of all the pollution, that's district heating systems. What they do is effectively build 4 or 5 apartments and they put an unfiltered brown coal lignite burning little district heater in the middle of them and they just run it flat tack, and that's it just runs flat out. And you end up with this massive amount of pollution that sits in the region that Beijing sits in. Unfortunately, it's not them that get the worst of it. It's the valleys next door. There's a great program on Netflix, if you haven't caught it, on pollution in China, focusing on a couple of families and how sick their children get. These are 2-3-year-olds, and how many of the children have to be sent away from this village because of these damn district heaters. Now, for Hiro, district heating's a piece of cake. We've been attending the D4 District Heating Summit in Denmark every year. We send our top scientists. They're in discussions with them at the moment, and that's one of our projects that we're working on. Anyone else?
You're based in Australia. What are the particular special political or market barriers and opportunities of this in the US as compared to Australia or other countries?
I don't think there are barriers in the US. One of the interesting things with Hiro is we actually make it profitable to go zero emission. And that's one of the keys to this thing. I've never believed gluing yourself to a pavement or screaming about climate change is necessarily going to do much. You have to go to the human condition, and the human condition is, we all want to be successful, we all want to make money, we all want to make profits, we want our companies to be successful, we want our employees to be happy. If you can do that for a power station that is imminently about to close, is being priced out of the market with pollution, you can actually change that by simply changing it to Hiro, killing their coal in feed and all the pollution out feed. There are
specific objectives for the U.S. market based on that. Are you looking to expand into the U.S. market?
Yeah, US market is definitely on the plans. I would have to say that at the moment, probably Japan and Germany are ahead, but the US market is definitely, it is a more difficult market to get into. Definitely, there's a lot of, we see US as a whole bunch of individual little countries. And the rest of the world doesn't work like that. It's really odd. Australia, if you want to get something done, you go see the federal government, and the states are there to do their jobs. And yes, they're involved, but you go see the federal government and get it done. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you tomorrow morning.